Ed here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share my first update on my experience with the Sony RX100 Mark VI. Now, for those of you that follow my channel, you know that I've covered every single RX100 since its launch, and the Mark VI is unique, much like every other RX100 before it. And the reason being is that not only is it the most expensive point-and-shoot camera ever made, as has every RX100 before it, every predecessor, but this camera in particular at $1,200 US, just released yesterday, now takes the RX100 out of being just the best pocketable point-and-shoot camera on the market into the realm of being also the best pocketable video camera on the market. And it does that because with this latest and greatest version of the RX100, we now have moved from a 24 to 70 millimeter lens to a 24 to 200 millimeter lens. Now, I know many of you may be asking yourself, do I really need that extra focal reach? And well, if you don't, the RX100 Mark IV and 5 are still readily available and less expensive than the $1,200 asking price point that this camera demands. Another reason that this is the best video camera that you can fit in your pocket is that it is the first Sony camera, the first CyberShot camera that is, to have HDR video capability. So in the past, S-Log was added to the Mark V, but not HLG, which is hybrid log gamma, which is going to permit you to actually capture 4K HDR content with this camera. So between the pairing of 4K video and the extended telephoto zoom, already I'm seeing amazing results that I simply could not achieve with the Mark V or, of course, the Mark IV. Now, bear in mind that video is still limited to 5 minutes in 4K. You can throw on the HFR, the high frame rate, and shoot 240 frames per second, but I think you're better off sticking with 120 frames internally in the camera and slowing it down in video editing software. I only say that because, like every Sony CyberShot that has introduced HFR, the video quality simply isn't stunning. It's good for quick on-the-fly slow motion, but you'll of course do better taking video out of this and slowing it down yourself, as I mentioned, like with the 120 frames per second. Now, one of the things I really like that Sony did here with their EVF is they've made it a single touch, and there's a reason they advertise it on the box, because now when you pull down that lever to eject the OLED EVF, you can immediately start using it. It still has the sensor to determine whether or not your eye is to it, and just as easily as you made the EVF basically eject from the body, it retracts. So there's no more pulling out, basically the EVF would eject on the Mark V and the Mark IV, and then you would have to pull out the EVF to start using it. And to put it away, you'd have to go through the exact same motion, slide in the EVF and then push it down. So here, it's again gone to as simple as ejecting and just pushing it back down. Another thing that you should be aware of with this camera is you no longer have the neutral density filter that was on the Mark V. Now, this is something I wish they would have retained, but for whatever reason, probably it has something to do with this new lens, Sony had to abandon. Now, bear in mind that with the 24 to 200 millimeters that we're now afforded with the incredibly expensive Mark VI, it is still a very competent piece of Carl Zeiss glass, rated at f2.8 to f4.5 throughout its range. So that's still very good. So even though we don't have the f1.8 to f2.8 of the RX100 Mark V, we're still very close, and we do still have the exact same autofocus system, which was the first of its kind when it launched on the Mark V, here with the Mark VI. So we actually do have a hybrid autofocus system with the RX100 Mark VI. So that, paired with the telephoto capability, is just a no-brainer in my opinion, because 315 points of phase detection, now with the advantage of actually having some telephoto reach makes this camera a more dynamic product than its predecessor. Now, Sony wouldn't want to call the RX100 Mark V its predecessor or refer to this as a successor, because Sony has continued to sell all of the RX100 cameras going all the way back to first gen. To this day, I believe the first gen is still available for sale, and that's because they all represent different price points, but are all still excellent photographic tools. This, on the other hand, is where we go from just still photography being the emphasis to more of a balance with video, in my opinion, and that's between the longer lens and the HDR capability. Clearly a signal that Sony wants this to carry a premium, because it's now truly the best of both worlds in your pocket. Don't get me wrong, every RX100 that Sony ever made was about being the best of both worlds in your pocket. However, this one really does stand apart from all previous generations because of its HDR capability, as well as, most importantly, the telephoto reach that just did not exist. Now, in terms of inputs and outputs and form factor, everything is exactly the same. The biggest change is really the EVF that I just showed you. I've mentioned no ND filter. I've mentioned, obviously, the extended zoom range. No Play Memories application store here, which I would have liked to have seen, but it does seem that after the RX100 Mark V, Sony was parting ways with the Play Memory store. So that's gone. You do still, of course, have the same flash, which is definitely a welcomed addition and always has been. No hot shoe on this camera, no microphone input on this camera. I know a lot of you out there are scratching your heads. Why wouldn't they put a microphone input? Well, even on a $1,200 camera, Sony has a reason to make sure that this doesn't impede or cannibalize sales of other products in their lineup. And quite frankly, I'll mention this all the time for anyone who complains. Yes, it would be nice to have a microphone port integrated into this camera, but anyone who's doing any kind of pro-grade video with a camera of this nature, which you could do, or with any camera for that matter, you're likely going to be recording your audio separately anyway, so this is kind of an idiotic... don't get me wrong, I would like to have a microphone jack on here, but when people say, oh, if only it had a mic jack, I'd fork over the $1,200, I'm just wondering if they're morons, because the reality is that anyone who shoots professional video is going to have separate audio anyway and not be leaning on a microphone jack on body. Just putting that out there. Even though I'm not a pro, I still know that much. And that's why I have to mention it, because I've seen a lot of people criticize this camera for not having a mic jack, and quite frankly, it's a pocket camera, folks. I mean, what are you looking for? There's nothing else that competes with this on the market. That's the reason it carries a $1,200 price point. Don't get me wrong on this either. Panasonic does make very compelling alternatives, but those alternatives do not have 24 frames per second. Those alternatives do not have HDR capability. Those alternatives, even though they have 1-inch sensors, do not have the fidelity that this camera packs into it. And that's a big difference. And one of the most important features, of course, is those alternatives also do not have an articulating screen that comes, all the way around, so that you can actually video or take still images of yourself, which is why Sony introduced a selfie stick of sorts that hooks up to the multi-port and gives you shutter control, video capture control on a handheld stick that you just mount right here at the tripod mount. Something that I think will sell. It's not something I personally need, but I can see the utility for people who are vlogging or are selfie addicts. After all, as soon as Sony introduced this flip-around screen, they were absolutely catering to those of you out there that want to be able to take selfies, and I think it was a good move. I can't tell you how many times with my RX100 Mark V that was something I used on my latest month of travels in order to get a shot that I really couldn't achieve even if I handed the camera to someone else to take a picture. The shots I took myself with the screen ended up coming out better than all of those shots from random strangers, which you know I don't love handing my gear off to strangers on a trip, especially anywhere in the world, let alone some of the places I went to, because they are known for pickpocketing, stealing. Not that the States isn't as bad a place as any. The whole point does come down to that This camera absolutely pushes the envelope, and even though it does command a new higher price point that is very hard to justify, that can be said of every single RX100 to date. So anyone who's saying, oh my God, $1,200, I could buy an interchangeable lens camera, guess what? You could have done that with the Mark V price point at $950. You could have done that with the Mark IV price point at $850. And I could just go on, generation to generation, where you easily could have said, for this much money, I could be buying X, Y, or Z. The point is, what you can't buy is something that directly compares to this, and something that's going to give you this sort of capability in your pocket. And obviously, budget is not your primary issue if you're interested in the RX100 lineup. And if it is, you'll be looking at older generations where you actually can buy the still imaging capability, at the very least, at an affordable price. I mean, you can even go back in time to when there was a hot shoe up here. So far, great experience, sharp throughout the range, 24 to 200. Of course, things get a little soft at the 200 mark, but so far what I'm seeing is basically a miniature RX10 Mark IV, but with HDR video capability. So that's definitely a good thing, and it fits in my pocket. Granted, it of course does not accomplish the 600 millimeter feet that the RX10 is capable of, but it does just about everything else that you could want and is able to fit in a pocket or maybe a bag. You know, it's not that small, but it's small enough that you're never going to really complain about carrying this thing around. So far, I'm really enjoying the Mark VI. My only complaint, which has remained the same since the unboxing, I wish we had a new battery type. Even if that came at the expense of making the camera a little bit larger, I think it's about time we get a new battery type from Sony. And I would like to have play memories, but that's really not a major complaint. The battery type is one that I think is warranted, because we're in our 6th generation and we're still working on the same battery type. Come on, Sony. This is one area where you absolutely could have raised the bar. I mean, you've done it in every other possible way. Any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. Hit that like button, and as usual, please feel free to subscribe. Later.